One moment, the greatest ship in England is sailing triumphantly through the night waters of the English Channel. The next moment, it is gone. The year is 120 AD, the night of November 25th, off the coast of Normandy. A vessel called the White Ship, the finest and fastest in the entire royal fleet, sits docked at the port of Barfleur, loaded with the cream of English and Norman nobility. Young men and women laughing, drinking, celebrating, the flower of a generation, the heirs to thrones and titles and fortunes. And then, within minutes of leaving port, history's most consequential maritime disaster tears apart not just a ship, but an entire dynasty. The wreck of the White Ship did not just kill 300 people. It killed the future of England itself, setting in motion a chain of events that would plunge the kingdom into nearly 2 decades of brutal civil war, reshape the monarchy, and change the course of English history forever. This is not simply the story of a ship that hit a rock. This is the story of arrogance, celebration, drunkenness, and the terrifying randomness of fate. This is the story of how one night of revelry erased a generation of nobility and left a throne without an heir. To understand why the sinking of the White Ship mattered so profoundly, you must first understand the world in which it happened. The year 1120 was, by all appearances, a moment of triumph for King Henry I of England. Henry was one of the most capable rulers medieval Europe had ever produced, a man known as Beauclerk, meaning fine scholar, for his unusual education and administrative brilliance. He had seized the English throne after the death of his brother William Rufus in 1100, consolidated power.
The finest vintage for the king's son.
Indeed, we must celebrate our return to England.
A fair wind and a following sea.
Power with ruthless efficiency, and spent 2 decades building one of the most sophisticated royal administrations in European history. His kingdom was stable, his treasury was full, and his enemies were subdued. In November 1120, Henry had just concluded a successful campaign in Normandy, his ancestral duchy across the Channel, and had negotiated peace with the French king Louis VI. It was a moment of genuine political triumph. The king and his court were riding a wave of confidence and celebration as they prepared to sail back to England from the Norman port of Barfleur. Everything in that golden November evening seemed perfect. Henry had an heir. His son William Adelin, just 17 years old, was the center of the royal universe, the guarantee of dynastic continuity, the future of the House of Normandy. William was everything a medieval prince was supposed to be: young, energetic, of royal blood on both sides, recently married to a wealthy French noblewoman, and freshly confirmed in his status as heir by the very treaty his father had just negotiated. The French king himself had accepted William's homage for the Duchy of Normandy, cementing the young prince's future. That evening in Barfleur, William Adelin was celebrating, and he had every reason to celebrate. The White Ship was the pride of the English fleet. Its captain was Thomas Fitzstephen, whose father had commanded the Conqueror's flagship during the Norman invasion of England more than 50 years earlier. Thomas approached King Henry personally at Barfleur, presenting himself with obvious pride, reminding the king of his father's loyal service and requesting the honor of carrying the king himself across the Channel. Henry was gracious but declined. He had already made his arrangements to sail on another vessel. But he granted Thomas something arguably more precious and certainly more tragic: the honor of carrying Prince William and the young nobility of
We sail away to fortune and fame, so raise a glass and shout my name. Hooray, hooray, the wind.
the court. This decision, made with casual generosity in a busy harbor, sealed the fate of 300 people. The White Ship was loaded with the most brilliant and aristocratic young people in England and Normandy. Prince William himself came aboard, along with his half-brother Richard and his half-sister, the Countess of Perche. The passengers included the sons and daughters of the greatest noble families, the next generation of earls and barons and courtiers, young men who would have commanded armies and governed counties, young women who would have cemented alliances through marriage. They brought with them servants and sailors and rowers, filling the sleek vessel to capacity. And they brought wine, enormous quantities of wine. This is where the story darkens. The passengers and crew of the White Ship were, by the time the vessel prepared to depart, extraordinarily drunk. The young nobility had been celebrating all day, and they continued celebrating on board, distributing wine freely to the sailors and rowers who would be responsible for navigating the ship through the darkness. Contemporary accounts describe scenes of raucous festivities, singing, laughter. the kind of euphoric confidence that comes from youth and privilege and too much wine on a night of triumph. A group of priests came to bless the ship before departure, as was customary, but the young revelers mocked them with such crude and drunken behavior that the priests gave up and left the ship without completing the blessing. This detail lodged itself in the memories of medieval chroniclers as an omen, a sign that God had already withdrawn his protection from the vessel. The White Ship departed Barfleur well after dark, long after King Henry's vessel had already sailed. The prince reportedly wanted to race his father across the channel to arrive in England before the king, and he ordered the crew to row hard and fast. The oarsmen, drunk and eager to please their royal passenger, threw themselves into the effort with reckless enthusiasm. The White Ship flew out of Barfleur harbor at tremendous speed, faster than was safe, faster than was wise, cutting through the darkness with no margin for error. The rock that doomed the White Ship was called Quillebeuf, a well-known hazard to sailors familiar with those waters. Under normal circumstances, with a sober and careful crew, it would have been avoided without difficulty. But the crew of the White Ship that night was neither sober nor careful. The vessel struck the rock at full speed with devastating force. The collision tore open the hull immediately. The White Ship, the fastest and finest vessel in the royal fleet, began to sink within minutes. What followed was chaos of the worst kind, darkness and cold water and panic, and the screaming of 300 people suddenly confronted with death. A small rowboat was launched, and Prince William was placed in it, pulled away from the sinking ship to safety. For a brief moment, the heir to England was going to survive. But then he heard the voice of his half-sister, the Countess of Percha, screaming from the sinking ship, and William ordered the rowboat to turn back for her. This decision, born of love or loyalty or simple human decency, was his last. The rowboat returned toward the White Ship, but was immediately overwhelmed by dozens of drowning people, desperate to grab onto anything that would keep them afloat. The small boat capsized under the weight of desperate hands. Prince William drowned in the cold black waters of the English Channel, within sight of the rock that had killed his ship. Of the 300 or more people aboard the White Ship, only one survived. A butcher from Rouen named Berold clung to a floating spar through the freezing night and was rescued the following morning. Every other soul aboard perished in the darkness. The bodies of the drowned, including Prince William, were never recovered. The sea kept them. The news reached King Henry at his court in England, and the effect was said to be catastrophic. The king, already in his 50s and hardened by decades of brutal political struggle, reportedly collapsed when told of his son's death. Contemporary chroniclers describe him as being destroyed by grief, unable to eat, barely able to function. It was said that from that day forward, no one ever saw Henry I smile again. He had lost not only his beloved son, but the entire framework of his political legacy. Everything he had built, every alliance he had forged, every treaty he had negotiated, had been structured around the assumption that William Adelin would inherit the throne. That assumption was now at the bottom of the English Channel. The practical consequences unfolded with terrible logic. Henry had only one legitimate child remaining, his daughter Matilda, who had been married to the Holy Roman Emperor Henry V and was living in Germany. In 1125, the emperor died, and Matilda returned to her father's court. Henry, with no other options, designated Matilda as his heir, forcing his barons to swear oaths of loyalty to her as future queen. This was deeply controversial. No woman had ever ruled England in her own right. The Norman and English aristocracy were deeply uncomfortable with the idea of female sovereignty, and their oaths to Matilda were taken with varying degrees of sincerity. Henry tried to strengthen Matilda's position by marrying her to Geoffrey of Anjou, a strategic alliance that was meant to provide her with a powerful husband and military support. But the marriage was personally unhappy and politically complicated, and it generated as many problems as it solved. When Henry I died in 1135, the succession collapsed immediately. His nephew Stephen of Blois seized the throne, claiming that Henry had changed his mind on his deathbed and named him heir instead. Matilda contested this claim. The result was a period of civil war known as the Anarchy. Nearly 20 years of brutal conflict between the forces of Stephen and Matilda that devastated England, destroyed the administrative achievements Henry had spent his life building, and left the country exhausted and traumatized. All of this, every year of suffering and burning villages and starving peasants and betrayed oaths, traced its origin back to a single November night in 1120 when a drunken crew steered the White Ship into a rock. The wreck of the White Ship stands as one of history's most perfect illustrations of how a single catastrophic moment can redirect the course of civilization. There was nothing inevitable about any of it. The ship was sound. The route was known. The route was a charted hazard. If the crew had been sober, if the departure had been less rushed, if the night had offered slightly better visibility, the White Ship would have crossed the Channel safely. William Adelin would have reached England, inherited his father's throne, and the history of medieval Britain would have been entirely different. The anarchy would never have happened. The specific constitutional arrangements that emerged from that period of chaos, including the compromises and precedents that shaped the English monarchy for generations, would never have been necessary. The particular political vacuum that produced such remarkable consequences simply would not have existed. Instead, one young prince decided to race his father across the Channel. One crew of sailors celebrated too enthusiastically and drank too freely. One ship moved too fast through too dark a night, and the future changed completely. The story of the White Ship endures not just because of its historical consequences, but because of its human dimensions. There is something uniquely devastating about a disaster that claims an entire generation at once, that removes from the world not just individual people, but the entire web of relationships and futures they represented. Those 300 people in the cold Channel waters were not abstract historical casualties. They were young men who would have grown into lords and commanders, young women who would have become mothers of dynasties, servants and sailors who had families waiting for them in English ports. The survivors on shore, the fathers and mothers and siblings who waited for ships that never arrived, experienced a grief that was both intensely personal and collectively civilizational. An entire social world was erased in a single night. The White Ship took with it not just lives, but possibilities, futures, the children of those children, the decisions that would have been made, and the alliances that would have been forged across generations yet unborn. History is haunted by its own roads not taken, and few hauntings are as vivid or as consequential as the one that began when a magnificent ship struck a rock in the dark waters off Barfleur on the night of November 25, 1120, and carried 300 souls and the fate of a kingdom down into the cold and keeping sea.